The wind, a thin, keening sound like a grieving woman, whipped Ilara's threadbare shawl tighter around her shoulders as the stagecoach lurched to a halt. Dust, the color of dried blood, settled over her meager valise and the hopeful, trembling contents of her heart. This was it, Redemption Creek. The name itself felt like a dare, a challenge thrown down by the raw, unforgiving land that stretched in every direction, vast and indifferent beneath a sky too large, too empty. She clutched the worn letter in her pocket, the ink slightly blurred from her anxious touch. Mr. Josiah Hemlock. Her future, such as it was, hinged on the man whose carefully penned words had promised a home, a life, a shield against the biting loneliness of her past. Hope, a fragile seedling, pushed against the compacted earth of her apprehension. The door of the stagecoach was wrenched open, and a gruff voice barked, "End of the line, miss." Ilara descended, her legs stiff, her eyes blinking against the harsh sunlight that seemed to bleach all color from the ramshackle buildings lining the single dusty street. A few faces turned, curious, impassive. And then a man stepped forward from the shadow of the general store, tall and broad, with a face like weathered granite and eyes the color of a winter sky. Mr. Josiah Hemlock. He was older than his letter had implied, his mouth set in a severe line. He appraised her, a slow, deliberate scan from the scuffed tips of her boots to the too bright hope in her eyes, and a frown carved deeper lines into his forehead. "You're Ilara Johnston?" he asked, his voice a gravelly rumble that held no welcome. "Yes, Mr. Hemlock," she managed, her voice smaller than she intended. I came as we arranged." He snorted, a sound of pure derision. "Arranged? This ain't what was arranged." His gaze swept over her again, lingering on her slight frame, her youthful face that still held the ghost of girlhood, despite the hardships she had endured. The letter spoke of a woman grown, ready for the rigors of this life. You're a child." A cold dread, sharp as a shard of ice, pierced through Ilara's fragile hope. "I am 18, sir," she said, a tremor in her voice. "I am strong, I can work. The agency assured me." "The agency assured you wrong." Hemlock cut her off, his voice rising, drawing more attention from the few loiterers. "I need a wife, a helpmate, not a babe to coddle. Look at you. You'd snap like a twig in the first decent wind." His words were a public dismissal, a brand of inadequacy seared onto her in the open glare of Redemption Creek. Humiliation burned her cheeks. "You're too young, too unsuitable. I won't have it. You can turn right around on that same stage, girl. I've no use for you." The stagecoach driver, impatient, called out, "Anyone else for the return east, leaving in 5. Ilara's world tilted. "But I have nowhere else to go," she whispered, the words lost in the sudden finality of his pronouncement. Her savings were spent on the ticket, on the faint dream of a new beginning. He simply turned his back, a gesture of absolute rejection, and strode back towards the store, disappearing into its dim interior. The few onlookers, their curiosity sated, turned away, their faces shuttered against her plight. The driver slammed the stagecoach door. The whip cracked. Dust billowed, and then silence, save for the mournful sigh of the wind. Ilara stood alone, her valise at her feet, a tiny, abandoned figure in the vast, uncaring emptiness of the street. The seedling of hope had been brutally uprooted, leaving only a raw, bleeding wound. For a long moment, Ilara could not move, rooted to the spot by a despair so profound it felt like a physical weight pressing down on her chest, stealing her breath. The dust settled around her, coating her worn dress, a tangible manifestation of her desolation. The sun beat down, mercilessly highlighting her isolation. She looked down the street, at the closed doors and blank windows. No kindness there, no flicker of compassion in the few faces that had briefly registered her existence. Redemption Creek. It felt more like condemnation. What was she to do? Where could she turn? The questions echoed in the hollow chambers of her mind, met only by the howling emptiness of her future. She walked then, aimlessly, her valise bumping against her leg, a leaden reminder of her foolish hopes. The town offered no solace. Each building seemed to eye her with suspicion, each gust of wind whispered of her folly. Thirst clawed at her throat, but the thought of approaching anyone, of enduring another cold stare, another curt dismissal, was more than she could bear. The landscape beyond the town's meager sprawl was even more daunting, a wilderness of rock and scrub, indifferent to human suffering. The sky, once a canvas for her dreams, now seemed a vast, oppressive lid. She was a speck, insignificant and lost. From the cool shade of the livery stable, Silas Blackwood had watched the exchange. He had seen the girl arrive, her face pale but alight with a nervous anticipation that even his own calloused heart recognized. He had seen Hemlock, a man known for his rigid piety and equally rigid meanness, dismiss her with a cruelty that was both predictable and galling. Silas was no stranger to loss, to the harsh judgments of others. His own ranch, miles out of town, was a testament to his preference for solitude over the company of men like Hemlock. He was an outsider by choice and by circumstance, his life shadowed by a grief that time had dulled but never erased. He saw her now, a small, solitary figure drifting towards the edge of town, her shoulders slumped, the very picture of despair. Something in her quiet dejection, in the way she seemed to shrink into herself, resonated with a long-dormant protective instinct. He was not a man given to impulse, his actions as deliberate and measured as his words, but the sight of her, so utterly alone, stirred him. He emerged from the livery, his own supplies loaded onto his buckboard, and without a word, guided his horse in her direction. Ilara heard the slow clop of hooves and the creak of wagon wheels behind her. She tensed, expecting more scorn, perhaps a command to leave the town's vicinity. She turned, her heart hammering against her ribs, and saw him, a tall, lean man, his face weathered and unreadable, his eyes a startling, clear gray that seemed to see right through her. He pulled the wagon to a halt beside her. He didn't speak, merely gestured with a slight inclination of his head towards the empty space on the buckboard beside him. It was not an invitation offered with warmth, but neither was it unkind. It was a simple, practical offer, stark and unadorned. She hesitated. Mistrust was a lesson learned early and reinforced often, but then she looked into his eyes again and saw not judgment nor pity, but something else, a quiet understanding, perhaps. Or was it just the reflection of her own desperation? Her throat was too tight to speak, her options were stark: remain here, exposed and without hope, or accept this stranger's silent offer. With a deep, shuddering breath that felt like her last reserve of courage, Ilara nodded. He reached down a calloused hand, not to help her up, but simply as a steadying point if she needed it. She grasped her valise, and with a surge of will, climbed onto the hard wooden seat. The man clucked to his horse, and the wagon moved forward, leaving Redemption Creek and its casual cruelty behind them. The journey was made in an almost complete silence, broken only by the rhythmic creak of the wagon and the soft thud of the horse's hooves on the dry earth. Ilara sat stiffly, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her gaze fixed on the endless horizon. The man, Silas Blackwood as she would later learn his name to be, seemed content with the quiet. He handled the reins with an easy competence, his profile etched against the fading light. The landscape grew wilder, the ranches more infrequent, until finally, as dusk began to purple the sky, he turned the wagon onto a barely discernible track that led towards a low-slung cabin nestled against a backdrop of stark, imposing mesas. Smoke curled from its stone chimney, a thin, solitary plume in the vast emptiness. This was his home, her temporary and utterly uncertain sanctuary. The cabin was small, rustic, but clean. A single room served as kitchen, living area, and, judging by the neatly made bed in one corner, his sleeping quarters. A rough-hewn table and 2 chairs stood near the stone fireplace, where a small fire now crackled, warding off the evening chill. There was an air of spare utility about the place, yet it was not unwelcoming. It was the abode of a man accustomed to solitude, a man who wasted nothing, not even space. Silas gestured towards a narrow cot pushed against the far wall, a thin blanket folded upon it. "You can sleep there," he said, his voice gruff, unused. It was the first time he had spoken directly to her since leaving town. Over the next few days, a tentative pattern began to emerge. Ilara, desperate to prove her worth, to not be a burden, rose early. She tidied the small cabin, swept the wooden floor with a worn broom she found, and, finding a small store of flour and dried beans, prepared simple meals. Silas accepted her efforts without comment, but she noticed he left extra wood for the stove and a pail of fresh water near the door each morning before he left for his long days working the ranch. They ate their meals mostly in silence, yet it was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the quiet of 2 people observing, learning. She watched him, his movements economical and sure, his face often shadowed by thoughts he did not share. He, in turn, observed her quiet industry, the way she mended a tear in one of his work shirts with neat, almost invisible stitches, the gentle way she spoke to the aloof ranch dog that sometimes ventured near the cabin door. Small, unspoken gestures became their language. A cup of hot coffee left for her on the hearth when she awoke. A wild prairie bloom, plucked and placed in a chipped tin cup on the table. These were the nascent tendrils of trust, fragile yet persistent, growing in the spaces left by their shared quiet. She learned to read the subtle shifts in his expression, the slight softening around his eyes when he found a warm meal waiting. The way his shoulders seemed less burdened after a day free from the prying eyes of Redemption Creek. He, she sensed, was learning to see beyond the too young label Hemlock had so cruelly affixed to her, recognizing a resilience, a quiet strength that belied her youth. One evening, as a storm raged outside, the wind howling like a banshee around the eaves of the cabin, the enforced intimacy seemed to loosen their tongues. The fire cast dancing shadows on the rough log walls. Ilara, mending a saddle blanket by its flickering light, found herself speaking of the orphanage, of the endless gray days, the gnawing hunger for belonging, for a place, any place, to call home. She spoke of the desperation that had led her to answer Mr. Hemlock's advertisement, the last, fragile hope of a girl who had known too much of hardship. Her voice was low, threaded with a sorrow that was old and deep. Silas listened, his gaze fixed on the fire, his hands resting on his knees. When she finished, a long silence stretched between them, filled only by the roar of the wind and the crackle of the flames. Then he spoke, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. He did not speak of his wife directly, but of the silence that had descended upon the ranch after she was gone, a silence so profound it had nearly swallowed him whole. He spoke of the land, his only companion for so long, its harsh beauty both a comfort and a constant reminder of his solitude. He didn't offer pity, nor did she seek it. Instead, in their shared, halting confessions, a bridge of understanding was built, a mutual recognition of past wounds that, though different, had left similar scars. The storm outside continued its fury, but within the small cabin, a fragile peace, born of shared vulnerability, had taken root. The days settled into a rhythm, a fragile normalcy that Ilara clung to with a quiet desperation. The ranch became her world, its boundaries defined by the distant mesas and the endless sky. She learned the chores, her hands, once soft, becoming calloused from drawing water, tending the small vegetable patch Silas allowed her to cultivate, and helping with the mucking out of the small barn that housed his single horse and a milk cow. Silas, in turn, seemed to slowly unbend, the harsh lines around his mouth softening occasionally into something that might, with a stretch of the imagination, be called a smile. He taught her to identify edible plants, to read the signs of changing weather in the clouds, to listen to the language of the land. An unspoken commitment was forming between them, a reliance born of shared tasks and quiet companionship. She felt a nascent sense of belonging, a fragile shoot pushing through the hard-packed earth of her past despair. It was not the life she had envisioned, but it was a life, and for the first time in a long time, it held a glimmer of peace. This fragile peace, however, was not destined to remain undisturbed. The outside world, in the form of Jedediah Thorne, a garrulous itinerant trader who occasionally made his way to the isolated ranches, intruded upon their sanctuary. Thorne, his wagon laden with goods and his tongue laden with gossip, brought news from Redemption Creek. "That Hemlock fella," he announced one afternoon, accepting a cup of Ilara's surprisingly good coffee. "He's still frothing about that mail-order bride he sent packin'. Says he was swindled. Now he's heard tell she's holed up out here with you, Blackwood." Thorne's eyes, sharp and assessing, flicked between Silas and Ilara. "Folks are talking. Preacher Martha's been making noises about impropriety. You know how it is." Ilara felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. The judgment of Redemption Creek, which she had naively hoped to have escaped, had found its way to their doorstep. She saw the familiar shadow cross Silas's face, the tightening of his jaw. The fragile bubble of their quiet existence had been pricked. Later, a necessary trip into town for supplies became an ordeal. Whispers followed Ilara down the main street. Eyes lingered on her with a mixture of censure and salacious curiosity. Mr. Hemlock himself, standing outside the mercantile, fixed her with a look of venomous contempt. So, the stray found a new kennel. He sneered, loud enough for several townsfolk to hear. Blackwood always did have a taste for damaged goods. Ilara flushed, shame and anger warring within her. Before she could utter a word, Silas, who had been tying their horse to the hitching post, stepped forward. He moved with a quiet deadliness that Ilara had never witnessed before. He didn't raise his voice, but his words, when they came, were like chips of ice. "Hemlock," he said, his gaze pinning the older man, "you will not speak of her that way again. She is under my protection." He paused, his eyes sweeping over the suddenly silent onlookers. "And if anyone else has aught to say, they can say it to me." There was an implicit threat in his stance, in the unwavering intensity of his stare, that brooked no argument. Hemlock, for all his bluster, seemed to shrink slightly under that gaze, muttering something unintelligible before turning abruptly and retreating into the store. The crowd dispersed, their appetite for confrontation apparently diminished. Silas's simple declarative statement, "She is under my protection," echoed in the sudden quiet, a shield thrown around her, a public claiming that, while not a declaration of matrimony, was a potent ward against further interference. The ride back to the ranch was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet, one filled with an unspoken understanding, a deeper cementing of their unlikely alliance. The fragile peace, however, was short-lived. Hemlock, his pride wounded and his self-righteousness inflamed, was not a man to let matters rest. He saw Ilara's presence at Silas's ranch not just as an affront to his judgment, but as a direct challenge to his standing in the small community. He began to subtly poison the well, spreading rumors that Ilara was a woman of loose morals, a temptress who had ensnared the reclusive Blackwood, perhaps even with an eye on his land. He painted Silas as a fool, or worse, a sinner, sheltering a corrupting influence. These whispers, like noxious weeds, began to take root in the fertile ground of small-town suspicion and judgmental piety. The threat was no longer just gossip, it was coalescing into something more tangible, more dangerous. The crisis materialized on a blustery autumn evening. A rider, one of Hemlock's known associates, a brutish man named Caleb Stone, arrived at the ranch just as dusk was settling. He did not dismount, but sat his horse by the fence line, his face shadowed by the brim of his hat. "Blackwood," he called out, his voice carrying a sneer. "Town council wants a word with you, and the girl. Seems there are concerns about vagrancy, and public morals. He spat a stream of tobacco juice onto the dry earth. Sheriff ain't here, but Hemlock and some concerned citizens figure it's time this situation was rectified. Silas stepped out of the cabin, Ilara close behind him, her heart thudding a nervous rhythm against her ribs. She saw the way Silas's hand instinctively went to the worn axe handle leaning against the cabin wall. "There's no vagrancy here, Stone," Silas stated, his voice calm but firm. "Ilara is my guest, and my affairs are my own." "Not when they offend decent folk," Stone retorted. "Hemlock says she's a troublemaker, got a bad influence. He wants her run out of the county. And he's got men who'll see it done, if you ain't sensible." The threat hung heavy in the air, raw and ugly. This was it, the confrontation they had perhaps both unconsciously dreaded. Ilara felt a surge of fear, but beneath it, something else, a fierce, protective anger. She would not be a passive victim again. She stepped forward slightly, beside Silas, her small stature no match for Stone's bulk, but her spirit unyielding. "I have done nothing wrong," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. "Mr. Hemlock rejected me because he deemed me too young. He knows nothing of my character." Stone just laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Character? Hemlock says your character's plain for all to see, shacked up with him." He gestured vaguely towards Silas. Silas's hand tightened on the axe handle. "You'll leave my property, Stone, now, and you tell Hemlock if he has business with me, he comes himself. He doesn't send his curs." Stone's eyes narrowed. "You'll regret this, Blackwood." He wheeled his horse abruptly and galloped off into the gathering darkness, leaving behind an atmosphere thick with menace. The shared fear and the quiet resolve to face what was coming drew Ilara and Silas even closer. That night, sleep was impossible. They sat by the dying embers of the fire, the silence punctuated by the wind's restless moaning. "He won't let this go," Ilara said softly, voicing the fear that lay heavy between them. "No," Silas agreed. "Hemlock's a man who needs to feel powerful, and he sees you as a challenge to that." He looked at her then, his grey eyes searching hers in the dim light. "You don't have to stay, Ilara. This isn't your fight." Her gaze met his, unwavering. "It became my fight the moment he humiliated me, and it became our fight when you offered me shelter when no one else would. I'm not leaving, Silas. Not unless you ask me to." A long moment passed. Then Silas reached out, his calloused fingers gently touching her cheek. It was a gesture of profound tenderness, more eloquent than any words. "I'm not asking you to leave, Ilara," he said, his voice rough with an emotion she couldn't quite name. In that shared moment of vulnerability, with the threat of Hemlock's malice looming over them, their bond, forged in hardship and mutual respect, solidified into an unbreakable commitment. They would face whatever came, together. The following morning dawned grey and ominous, the sky heavy with unfallen rain, mirroring the tension that hung over the ranch. They knew Hemlock would not delay. True to form, by mid-morning, a small group of riders appeared on the horizon, led by Hemlock himself, his face a mask of grim determination. Beside him rode Caleb Stone and 3 other men, their expressions sullen and vaguely threatening. They reined in their horses a short distance from the cabin, a clear line drawn in the dust. Silas and Ilara stood on the porch waiting. Silas held his old rifle, not pointing it, but holding it with a casual readiness that spoke volumes. Ilara stood beside him, her hands clasped, not in fear, but in a display of quiet solidarity. She had braided her hair neatly and wore her cleanest, though still mended, dress. There was a dignity about her that even Hemlock's scowl could not diminish. "Blackwood," Hemlock called out, his voice sharp with authority, or what he perceived as such. "We've come to escort this woman out of the county, for her own good and for the moral well-being of Redemption Creek." "This is my land, Hemlock," Silas replied, his voice even, carrying easily in the still air. "And Ilara is on it by my invitation. She's broken no law. She's a vagrant, an unattached female causing unrest. Hemlock blustered, his face reddening. The good people of this town won't stand for it. It was then that Ilara spoke, her voice clear and surprisingly strong, cutting through Hemlock's tirade. "Mr. Hemlock," she began, stepping forward slightly, though Silas's arm brushed hers, a silent reassurance. "You judged me without knowing me. You cast me aside based on my appearance, on your own narrow expectations. You speak of moral well-being, yet your actions that day were cruel and without compassion. Is that the standard of morality in Redemption Creek?" A murmur went through Hemlock's men. Her words, spoken with such quiet conviction, had an unexpected impact. "She has done nothing but work hard and live peaceably here," Ilara continued, her gaze sweeping over the riders. "She has sought only a place to belong, a chance to build a life after hardship. Is that a crime? This man," she gestured to Silas, "offered me kindness when you offered only scorn. He showed me decency when you showed me prejudice. Who, then, is truly upholding moral values here?" Hemlock, taken aback by her eloquence and her courage, sputtered, "She's twisting words. She's a Jezebel bewitching him." "She's a good woman, Hemlock," Silas stated, his voice like flint, "and she's my wife." A collective gasp, almost silent, went through the small assembly, including Ilara herself. Her head whipped around to look at Silas, her eyes wide with astonishment. He met her gaze briefly, a flicker of something unreadable in his own, before turning back to Hemlock. The declaration, though perhaps not legally sanctioned in that moment, was a powerful, undeniable claim. It redefined their relationship in terms the community, and Hemlock would have to acknowledge or directly defy with greater consequence. "Wife?" Hemlock echoed, his bluster deflating slightly. "Since when?" "Since it became necessary to protect her from men like you," Silas said, his meaning clear. "Now, I suggest you and your men leave my property. There's nothing more to discuss." He raised the rifle slightly, not aggressively, but as a clear statement of his resolve. The standoff stretched for a tense minute. Hemlock's men looked at each other, then at Hemlock, their enthusiasm for the confrontation visibly waning. They had come to intimidate a lone man and a supposedly defenseless girl, not to challenge a married couple on their own land, especially when one of them was Silas Blackwood, whose quiet demeanor belied a known capacity for determined action. Unexpectedly, from the track leading to the ranch, two more figures appeared on horseback. Jedediah Thorne, the trader, and surprisingly, the town's usually taciturn blacksmith, Mr. Olson, a man respected for his fairness. They had evidently heard the commotion or been alerted by Stone's earlier boasts. Thorne, ever one for the dramatic, called out, "Everything all right here, Silas?" Heard Hemlock was stirring up a hornet's nest. Mr. Olson, a man of few words, simply nodded towards Silas and Ilara, then fixed Hemlock with a disapproving stare. "This ain't right, Josiah," he said, his voice a low rumble. "The girl's done no harm, and Blackwood's a fair man. Let them be." The unexpected arrival of these two, representing a different facet of the community, one less driven by Hemlock's narrow piety and more by a sense of frontier justice and live and let live, shifted the balance. Hemlock looked from Silas's unwavering stance to the disapproving faces of Olson and Thorne, and then at his own men, who were now clearly uncomfortable. His righteous crusade was crumbling. The courage and integrity displayed by Ilara, her calm and articulate defense, and Silas's resolute, protective claim had swayed the uncommitted and exposed Hemlock's motivations as petty and cruel. The threat, for now, was neutralized. Hemlock, his face a mottled purple with suppressed rage and humiliation, spat on the ground. "This ain't over, Blackwood," he snarled, but the words lacked conviction. He yanked on his reins, wheeling his horse, and with a curt gesture to his men, they rode away, a disgruntled and defeated posse. The immediate danger had passed, leaving behind a profound sense of relief, exhaustion, and the dawning realization of what Silas's public declaration truly signified. In the quiet aftermath, as the dust settled from the departing riders, Ilara turned to Silas, her heart still aflutter. "Your wife?" she asked softly, a world of questions in her eyes. Silas met her gaze, a rare, faint smile touching his lips. He leaned the rifle against the cabin wall. It seemed like the right thing to say at the time. He admitted, his usual gruffness softened by an undeniable warmth. "And maybe," he added, his voice dropping lower, "the right thing to make true if you'd be willing, Ilara." The harsh lines of the landscape around them seemed to soften in that moment, the unforgiving land suddenly imbued with a sense of promise. The wind, which had earlier seemed to keen with sorrow, now whispered of new beginnings. Ilara looked at this man, this quiet, steadfast rancher who had seen past her youth, past the world's judgment, to the strength and wisdom within her. He had offered her not just shelter, but respect, protection, and now a future. The cabin, once just a temporary refuge, began to transform into a home. With Hemlock's influence diminished and his credibility shattered in the eyes of many townsfolk after the failed confrontation, a tentative acceptance began to extend towards Silas and Ilara. Mr. Olson, a man of quiet integrity, made a point of stopping by with a sturdy, well-crafted hoe as a gift for Ilara's expanding garden. Even Jedediah Thorne, on his next trading visit, brought a bolt of calico fabric, declaring it a wedding present of sorts, with a knowing wink. The small community, or at least its more tolerant members, seemed to tacitly acknowledge the legitimacy of their bond, forged as it was in adversity and mutual devotion. Ilara found a quiet joy in the rhythms of their shared life, the planting and harvesting, the mending and baking. The quiet evenings spent reading by the firelight while Silas worked on mending tack or simply sat in companionable silence. She learned the contours of his quiet strength, the depth of his unspoken affection. He, in turn, found his solitary world enriched by her presence, her resilience, her gentle spirit that had weathered so much yet refused to be extinguished. The ranch, once a place of lonely toil, now echoed with the soft sounds of a shared existence, the air filled with the subtle scent of baking bread and the promise of belonging. They were married by a traveling preacher a few months later, a simple ceremony witnessed by Mr. Olson and his wife, and a surprisingly supportive Jedediah Thorne. There were no frills, no grand pronouncements, just the quiet solemnity of vows exchanged under the vast prairie sky, vows that affirmed what their hearts already knew. Ilara, no longer the rejected mail-order bride, stood as Silas Blackwood's wife, her identity not defined by a past rejection or societal expectation, but by the love and respect she had found and cultivated in this harsh, beautiful land. She had arrived seeking a shield, and had found not only that, but a partner, a home, and a profound sense of self-worth that blossomed under the steadfast gaze of the widowed rancher who had seen her true wisdom. Their life was not without its continued hardships. The frontier was an unforgiving mistress, but now they faced them together. Ilara's gentle influence extended beyond the ranch. She began to quietly help other women in the sparse community, offering remedies learned from her meager education and a compassionate ear to those who, like her, had known hardship. Silas, once a recluse, found himself slowly re-engaging with the better elements of Redemption Creek, his standing elevated by his quiet courage and his evident happiness. Their home became a small beacon of resilience, a testament to the power of kindness in a world too often characterized by cruelty. The too young girl had not only survived, but had thrived, her wisdom not of years, but of the heart, a wisdom that had seen the good in a silent man and helped him find his own voice again. The found family they had created, rooted in mutual respect and hard-won love, was a testament to the enduring human spirit, a quiet triumph against the desolation they had both once known. Their days were filled with the simple grace of shared purpose, and their nights with a peaceful contentment, the once empty cabin now truly a home, filled with the warmth of a love that had taken root in the most unlikely of soils and blossomed into something strong and enduring.